When you look at the current state of Lake Powell, what you're really seeing is not just a declining water level, but a highly sensitive system reacting to multiple short-term pressures all at once. As of late in March 2026, the lake sits around 3,528 feet above sea level, more than 170 feet below full capacity. That number alone might not sound catastrophic, but in reservoir terms, it represents a dangerously reduced buffer. This buffer is what allows water managers to balance supply, energy production, and downstream commitments, and right now, that margin is shrinking faster than expected. The most immediate issue driving the 2026 outlook is not long-term trends, but this year's inflow collapse. According to hydrologists cited in recent reports, projections for April through July inflows have dropped dramatically to around 1.75 million acre-feet, which is a sharp downgrade from earlier expectations. This matters because that spring to summer period is the single most important refill window for the lake. Snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains typically feeds the Colorado River system during these months, but in 2026, the volume simply isn't there. This creates a cascading problem. Lake Powell is not an isolated body of water. It is a regulated storage unit within the Colorado River system controlled by Glen Canyon Dam. That dam is responsible for releasing water downstream to meet legal obligations to states like Arizona, Nevada, and California. So even when inflows are weak, outflows cannot simply stop. Water must continue moving downstream, which means the lake can drop even during critical periods. What makes 2026 particularly concerning is how quickly forecasts have deteriorated. Early in the year, inflow projections were already below average, but within weeks they were revised downward again, with expected runoff falling to just 27% of normal. That kind of sudden downgrade signals instability in the system, meaning planners cannot rely on early season forecasts anymore. Every revision forces new emergency considerations. Looking at your graph, the comparison between 2024, 2025, and 2026 tells a deeper story. In 2024, there was a noticeable recovery phase where levels climbed significantly into summer before gradually declining. In 2025, the pattern flattened, with only a modest seasonal rise followed by a steady drop. But in 2026, the trajectory is already weak early in the year, suggesting that even the typical seasonal rebound may not materialize. This is critical because Lake Powell depends heavily on that seasonal spike to maintain operational stability for the rest of the year. Another key factor is snowpack timing and melt behavior. Even when snowfall occurs, it doesn't guarantee reservoir recovery. What matters is how much of that snow actually becomes runoff. Rapid warming events can cause early melting or even direct evaporation, meaning less water reaches the reservoir. Reports indicate that 2026 has experienced one of the lowest snowpack to runoff conversions in decades, reducing the effective supply before it even enters the river system. This is where the concept of inflow efficiency becomes important. Not all precipitation becomes usable water. Some is absorbed into soil, some evaporates, and some never reaches the main river channels. In years like 2026, that efficiency drops significantly, meaning even average snowfall can produce below-average reservoir gains. At the same time, Lake Powell is dealing with a long-term structural issue that often goes unnoticed: sedimentation. Over decades, sediments carried by the Colorado and San Juan rivers have accumulated at the bottom of the reservoir, reducing its total storage capacity. So even if the lake appears stable at a certain elevation, it actually holds less water than it did decades ago. So the margin for error today is smaller than it was historically. The risk threshold that water managers are watching closely is the so-called minimum power pool, which is around 3,490 feet. Below this level, the dam's turbines can no longer generate hydroelectric power efficiently. While current levels are still above that threshold, projections suggest the lake could approach dangerously close to it later this year if inflows remain weak and releases continue as scheduled. And those releases are not optional. The Colorado River Compact legally requires the upper basin states to deliver a fixed amount of water downstream annually. This creates a situation where Lake Powell must act as a buffer, absorbing variability while still meeting obligations. When inflows drop, the lake itself pays the price. Another layer to this crisis is operational strategy. Federal agencies have already begun adjusting release patterns to conserve water in the reservoir. In some cases, upstream reservoirs may be used to send emergency water into Lake Powell to stabilize levels. But these measures are temporary solutions. They redistribute water within the system rather than increasing the total supply. If you zoom out, Lake Powell is currently estimated to be roughly a quarter full. That figure highlights how little margin exists compared to its full capacity of 24 million acre-feet. When a reservoir of that scale drops to such levels, every operational decision becomes more critical and more constrained. What's especially important to understand is that Lake Powell and Lake Mead function as a linked system. Water released from Powell flows directly into Mead, which then supplies millions of people. So any decline in Powell doesn't just stay upstream, it propagates through the entire Southwest water network. The psychological impact of the numbers is also significant. When projections show third lowest inflow on record, it signals not just a bad year, but a system under repeated stress. And when multiple low years occur close together, recovery becomes exponentially harder because the reservoir never gets a chance to fully recharge. Looking ahead through the rest of 2026, the most likely scenario is continued decline through late summer, potentially stabilizing only if inflows exceed expectations or releases are reduced. But neither outcome is guaranteed. In fact, some forecasts suggest the lake could fall below 3,500 feet by the end of the year under certain conditions, pushing it closer to operational limits. So what you're seeing in this chart is not just a drop in water level, it's a system approaching its operational boundaries. Every foot of elevation lost represents a reduction in flexibility, energy generation potential, and emergency response capacity. In the end, Lake Powell in 2026 is defined by uncertainty. Forecasts are shifting, inflows are underperforming, and the system is being forced to operate with less margin than ever before. The lake is still functioning, still delivering water, and still generating power, but it's doing so under increasing pressure, where even small changes in inflow or temperature can have outsized impacts.